The evening air carried a crisp saltiness, mingling with the faint notes of a violin drifting from the ship's grand ballroom. The SS Sovereign, a cruise liner renowned for its elegance, was a floating jewel, its polished decks gleaming under the glow of string lights. Tonight, it played host to an event of significance, a banquet honoring American veterans. They had gathered from across the nation, men and women whose lives had been shaped by service, sacrifice, and memories that time refused to dull. Elijah Carter stood at the gangway, one hand on the polished oak rail. The retired lieutenant general, a man of quiet dignity, had dressed impeccably a tailored navy suit, a tie with a modest silver pin, and shoes shined to a mirror finish. Yet, as he glanced around, his expression was that of someone preparing to wade through unseen currents. The other guests, predominantly older men in evening attire, exchanged hearty greetings and firm handshakes. Laughter punctuated the hum of conversation. For most, the night promised a chance to relive old stories and bask in the shared camaraderie of their service. But Elijah knew better than to expect easy acceptance. "Sir, your invitation?" a young attendant in a crisp uniform asked, his tone polite but perfunctory. Elijah handed over the embossed card without hesitation. The attendant barely glanced at him before motioning toward the grand staircase. "You'll find your seat near the aft section, sir." There was no malice in the words, only a subtle dismissal that Elijah had come to recognize over the years. He nodded his thanks and made his way inside. The dining hall was magnificent, every detail crafted to impress. Chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over the room, illuminating tables draped in fine linen and adorned with crystal glasses. The hum of conversation swelled as more guests arrived, their voices blending into a symphony of memories and laughter. Elijah's table was near the far corner, away from the main dais where the evening's distinguished speakers would sit. He hesitated for a moment, then settled into his seat. The place card read Elijah Carter in elegant script, as if to reassure him that he belonged, though the location of the table suggested otherwise. As he waited for the meal to begin, Elijah observed the room with a practiced calm. A group of men at a nearby table, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, were engaged in animated conversation. Their voices carried fragments of stories about distant battles and youthful exploits, filling the space between the clink of glasses. One of them glanced in Elijah's direction, his gaze lingering just a moment too long before he leaned toward his companions. A chuckle followed, subdued but unmistakable. Elijah kept his expression neutral, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. The years had taught him the power of silence. A server approached, setting down a breadbasket and a glass of water. The man didn't meet Elijah's eyes, his movements brisk, mechanical. Across the room, other tables were being attended with flourish, wine poured with a smile, plates placed with deference. Here, the service was efficient but cold. Elijah folded his hands, allowing the moment to pass without comment. He had long learned the art of patience, of enduring the small slights that often spoke louder than words. The violinist's melody shifted, filling the hall with a tune both wistful and haunting. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, letting the music carry him back to another time, a time when the weight of a nation rested on his shoulders. And every decision was a step into the unknown. The past was a constant companion, but tonight, it felt closer than usual. Around him, the banquet hall came alive with stories of valor and sacrifice. Elijah listened, his presence a quiet contradiction to the celebration. He had fought for this country, bled for it, and yet, here in this room of his peers, he was still an outsider. The ship's engines hummed beneath his feet, a steady rhythm propelling them forward. As the night unfolded, Elijah couldn't help but wonder, toward what horizon was this ship truly sailing? The soft clinking of cutlery and the hum of conversation filled the banquet hall as Elijah settled into his seat. He adjusted his jacket, letting his hand rest briefly on the edge of the table, where a modest arrangement of flowers served as the centerpiece. The chair felt sturdy yet distant, like so many things in life, functional but unwelcoming. Around him, the room buzzed with energy. Groups of veterans exchanged knowing glances, their laughter punctuated by the occasional raised glass. Stories rippled through the air, each one tethered to a memory of triumph or survival. Elijah Carter, a man who had earned his place among them many times over, sat quietly, a silent observer, at the table closest to the stage. A cluster of men in dark suits radiated authority. They gestured broadly, their voices carrying a subtle weight of certainty. Elijah recognized one of them, General Everett Hartman, a man whose accolades had been featured prominently in the events program. Hartman's presence at the head table was no surprise. He had a reputation, after all, as one of the most celebrated figures in military history. It was the table where Elijah might have sat, had things been different. Instead, he found himself in the aft section, surrounded by faces he didn't recognize. The men and women at his table were polite, their small talk cordial, yet their words lacked the warmth of genuine curiosity. They glanced at him briefly, then turned their attention elsewhere, as if his presence were a placeholder rather than a point of connection. The servers moved between tables, their steps quick and efficient. At the head table, they lingered, pouring wine with care and engaging in brief, light-hearted exchanges with the guests. Here, the service was quieter, almost mechanical. A glass of water was placed before Elijah without so much as a glance in his direction. Elijah's gaze swept the room, taking in the details with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life assessing situations. The grandeur of the hall was undeniable, from the crystal chandeliers to the gleaming silverware. Yet beneath the surface, there was a dissonance, a subtle imbalance that lingered like the faint discord in an otherwise harmonious melody. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Elijah turned to see a man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a chest full of medals approaching his table. The man's smile was polite, his handshake firm but brief. "Elijah Carter, isn't it?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," Elijah replied evenly. "I've heard of you," the man continued, his words carrying the kind of weight that could be either a compliment or a veiled challenge. "A lieutenant general, if I recall correctly?" "That's right," Elijah confirmed, his expression unreadable. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for something in Elijah's face. After a pause, he nodded, muttered a polite, "Pleasure to meet you," and moved on to another table. Elijah watched him go, his expression remaining calm. He had seen this dance before, the brief flicker of curiosity, followed by skepticism. It was the kind of encounter that left more unspoken than said. At a table nearby, a group of white veterans erupted into laughter. One of them, a man with a booming voice and a thick southern drawl, launched into a story about his time commanding troops overseas. His companions hung on his every word, nodding and laughing in all the right places. "Of course," the man added, his voice carrying across the room. "Back in those days, they didn't just hand out stars to anyone. You had to earn them." Though the comment wasn't directed at him, Elijah felt the weight of it. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass of water before he set it down carefully. The subtlety of the evening's exclusions was not lost on him. The unspoken judgments, the carefully veiled remarks, the quiet dismissal of his presence, they were all pieces of a larger pattern. He had spent his life navigating these waters, but that didn't make them any less turbulent. The violinist began a new piece, the melody rising and falling like waves on a restless sea. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as he looked across the room. He wasn't here to prove himself. Not anymore, but even so, the currents of the night demanded resilience. Some battles, he thought, were fought in silence. The wine glasses sparkled in the warm glow of the chandeliers, reflecting a muted elegance that belied the tension threading through the room. Dinner was underway, the courses arriving in a graceful procession. At Elijah's table, conversations meandered around polite topics: travel, grandchildren, and the occasional nod to shared military service. But the air remained thin, lacking the ease of true camaraderie. Elijah Carter quietly studied his plate, his thoughts detached from the meticulously arranged dish before him. The steak was tender, the asparagus crisp, the sauce expertly seasoned, but it all felt distant, as if it were prepared for someone else. He took a slow sip of water, the coolness grounding him as murmurs from nearby tables rose and fell like waves against the ship's hull. A burst of laughter erupted from the table closest to the stage, drawing the room's attention momentarily. General Everett Hartman was mid-anecdote, his commanding voice carrying effortlessly over the clink of silverware. And there I was, Hartman proclaimed, gesturing broadly, outnumbered 10-1. But I said to myself, Everett, you didn't come this far to back down now. The table erupted in laughter and applause, a chorus of admiration following his every word. At Elijah's table, a man in a neatly pressed suit leaned slightly toward him. His name was Samuel Crane, a retired colonel whose shoulders carried the quiet confidence of years in command. Didn't you serve in Operation Northern Star? Crane asked, his tone measured but curious. Elijah nodded. I did. I thought so, Crane replied, his brow furrowing slightly. I remember reading about a lieutenant general in that operation. You were logistics, weren't you? Combat strategy, Elijah corrected gently. Crane's expression froze for a moment, then softened into a polite smile. Ah, of course. A vital role. The words were harmless enough, but they carried a familiar weight. Elijah had spent his career justifying his presence in rooms where his rank should have been sufficient. He offered a brief nod, letting the conversation drift back into the background. From across the room, Hartman's booming voice broke through once more. Tell me, Hartman said, addressing his table, have you heard the one about the colonel who couldn't tell a map from his mess kit? The laughter came before the punchline, loud and unrestrained. Elijah's lips tightened slightly as he reached for his glass. He had heard this kind of humor before, the jokes that made light of mistakes, of incompetence. Always with the unspoken assurance that such failures could never belong to men like Hartman. General Carter, a voice interjected suddenly. Elijah turned to see one of the men from the nearby table looking at him, his expression somewhere between curiosity and skepticism. The man was younger, perhaps in his early 50s, his chest adorned with a row of medals that glinted under the lights. You're a general, right? The man asked, his tone bordering on incredulous. That's correct, Elijah replied evenly. The man raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward. Forgive me for asking, but when did you serve? I don't think I've come across your name in the usual circles. Elijah set his glass down deliberately, meeting the man's gaze. I served for 32 years. From 1971 to 2003. My name might not have appeared in the usual circles, but my work speaks for itself. The younger man chuckled, a hint of disbelief in his tone. 32 years? Impressive. And you made it to lieutenant general? That's quite a climb. It was, Elijah said quietly, his voice steady. The conversation around them paused, other guests glancing toward Elijah's table. The man smiled thinly, then turned back to his companions, who exchanged knowing looks. Elijah straightened in his chair, his gaze unwavering as the moment passed. He could feel the silent judgments around him, as familiar as the weight of his uniform once was. He reached for his glass again, this time letting the coolness linger on his fingers before he drank. The wine was dry, its sharpness lingering on his tongue. It reminded him of the countless nights spent balancing the bitterness of reality with the sweetness of accomplishment. The ship's engines hummed beneath them, a constant reminder of forward motion. Yet here, in this gilded room, progress felt slower, more fragile, a battle fought inch by inch. Elijah Carter had fought many battles in his life. Tonight, he fought one of silence and restraint, his dignity a shield against the quiet slights that cut deeper than words. Some victories, he thought, were measured not in applause but in the strength to remain steadfast. The meal progressed in measured silence at Elijah's table. Forks scraped against plates, conversations moved in polite whispers, and the occasional clink of glasses punctuated the quiet. Elijah sat with his back straight, his presence commanding yet unobtrusive, like a lighthouse standing firm against the encroaching tide. Across the room, the tone was different. At the head table, where the evening's luminaries sat in the glow of deference, laughter flowed freely. Stories of daring exploits, embellished with each retelling, rippled through the hall. It was a celebration of camaraderie, at least for some. Elijah listened without looking, the voices at the head table growing louder with each anecdote. The men spoke with a confidence that came from years of being heard. their words filling the room with an authority that brooked no doubt. One voice, in particular, carried above the others General Everett Hartman. Hartman leaned back in his chair. His posture relaxed, his presence filling the space. "It's not like the old days," he said, gesturing broadly. "Back then, leadership meant something. You had to earn it. Prove it every single day. There were no shortcuts." The men around him nodded, their agreement palpable. Elijah sipped his water, his gaze steady on the glass in his hand. The words weren't directed at him. Not overtly, but they lingered in the air like smoke, their meaning implicit. He had heard variations of this refrain before. The subtle questioning of credentials. The unspoken skepticism about how a man like him could rise so far. At a table nearby, a man with a weathered face and a chest full of medals turned to his companion. "Lieutenant General, huh?" he said, his voice low but not low enough. "I've been around a long time, and I don't recall seeing him in any major theaters. Maybe he was desk-bound." The other man chuckled. "Or just lucky." Elijah's hand tightened briefly around his glass. The words weren't new, they were the echoes of conversations he'd endured for years. From strangers, colleagues, even subordinates. But tonight, their weight felt heavier, the sharp edges more pronounced against the backdrop of the celebration. The servers returned, clearing plates and refilling glasses. Elijah observed their movements, precise and practiced, yet devoid of the warmth reserved for the tables near the stage. Here, the gestures were utilitarian, the smiles fleeting. "Mr. Carter," a voice called out from across the room. Elijah turned, his expression calm, to see one of the younger veterans standing. The man's voice carried, drawing the attention of several tables. "Lieutenant General Carter, is it true you served in Operation Northern Star?" The room quieted slightly, the lull in conversation creating a momentary void. Elijah set his glass down carefully. "Yes," he replied, his voice even. The man smiled thinly. "That was a critical operation, wasn't it? A lot of lives at stake." "It was," Elijah confirmed. "And you led it?" the man pressed, his tone bordering on disbelief. Elijah met his gaze steadily. "I did." A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Quiet but distinct. Elijah could feel the weight of their glances, the quiet calculations behind their eyes. General Hartman leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Elijah. "Northern Star," he said, as if testing the words. "That was the rescue mission, wasn't it? Took a lot of coordination." "From what I heard, it did," Elijah replied, "and a lot of courage from everyone involved." Hartman nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Impressive," he said after a pause, though the word landed with the faintest hint of reservation. Elijah inclined his head in acknowledgement, his face a mask of composure. The room returned to its rhythm, the moment passing like a cloud over the sun, leaving only faint shadows in its wake. The ship's engines thrummed beneath them, a steady reminder of forward motion. Yet in the room, progress felt elusive, caught in the undercurrents of doubt and perception. As dessert was served, Elijah glanced at the window beside him. The night stretched endlessly beyond the glass, the sea blending into the sky. It was a horizon he knew well, a place where clarity and obscurity coexisted, each shaping the other. Tonight, that horizon felt closer than ever. The room had grown quieter as the evening progressed, the hum of conversation now subdued beneath the rising cadence of the violinist's melody. The dessert plates had been cleared, and the soft chime of glasses heralded the imminent speeches. Elijah Carter sat in silence, his posture unchanging, his gaze steady as the subtle currents of the evening swirled around him. At the head table, General Everett Hartman rose to his feet, commanding the room's attention with a mere gesture. His voice, honed by decades of authority, carried effortlessly, even in its deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hartman began, his tone measured and confident. "Tonight, we gather not just to honor our shared service, but to celebrate the extraordinary accomplishments of a select few among us. Their courage, their leadership, and their unwavering dedication have shaped the history of our armed forces." Applause followed, polite and predictable, the kind that filled the air but rarely the heart. Elijah clapped briefly, his expression neutral. as Hartman continued. And yet, Hartman said, his gaze sweeping the room, among us tonight sits someone whose contributions, though perhaps lesser known, are nothing short of monumental. Someone whose leadership in one of our most critical operations saved countless lives and turned the tide of history. The room stilled, the quiet hum of expectation settling over the audience. Elijah felt the shift, the faint ripple of attention pulling toward him, though his expression betrayed nothing. Hartman's eyes found him, Lieutenant General Elijah Carter. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, a murmur spread, subtle and disbelieving, as heads turned toward Elijah. Hartman gestured toward him, his voice steady and reverent. Many of you may not know the full extent of General Carter's service. But let me assure you, his record speaks for itself. It was his leadership during Operation Northern Star that orchestrated one of the most daring and successful rescue missions in our military's history. A mission that not only saved lives but safeguarded the principles we hold dear. The murmurs faded, replaced by an almost tangible stillness. Elijah remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table, his expression calm yet unreadable. Hartman continued, his words deliberate. For his actions, General Carter received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Among other commendations, his courage, his strategic brilliance, and his unyielding commitment to his comrades have left an indelible mark on our nation's history. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then growing as the weight of Hartman's words sank in. Elijah stood slowly, acknowledging the room with a brief nod. His movements were measured, his presence commanding yet unassuming, as though he were not a man basking in accolades but one quietly affirming a truth he had long carried. The applause swelled, and for the first time that evening, the room seemed to recalibrate. The weight of unspoken doubts and silent judgments shifted, replaced by a ripple of recognition. As Elijah sat back down, the man at his table, Colonel Samuel Crane, leaned toward him, his voice low. I didn't realize, Crane began, but his words faltered. Elijah turned to him, his gaze steady. There's a lot people don't realize, he said simply. Crane nodded, his expression thoughtful, and sat back, his silence more telling than any words could be. The rest of the evening unfolded in subdued reflection. The violinist's melody, once a backdrop, now seemed to carry a different note, one of quiet triumph. Elijah remained composed, his thoughts as steady as the hum of the ship beneath him. This was not the first time he had needed to prove himself. Nor would it be the last. But tonight, the revelation was not for him, it was for them. For the room, for the silent reckoning it brought to those who had doubted. Elijah glanced toward the window, where the endless expanse of sea stretched into darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the future, vast and uncertain. Yet tonight, for a brief moment, there was clarity, a glimpse of what could be, should the world choose to see. As the applause ebbed and the room returned to its subdued hum, the weight of the revelation lingered. Conversations that had once flowed freely now carried a measured tone, each guest choosing their words with newfound consideration. Elijah Carter sat quietly at his table, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. The evening's rhythm resumed, but not without subtle shifts. Across the room, heads turned toward Elijah, some openly, others with sidelong glances. The moments were brief, fleeting, but their significance was unmistakable. Where there had been skepticism, there was now curiosity. Where there had been dismissal, there was now uncertainty. Colonel Samuel Crane cleared his throat softly. General Carter, he began, his voice tinged with hesitation. I'd like to apologize if my earlier remarks came across as dismissive. Elijah turned to him, his gaze steady but not unkind. No apology is necessary, he said. His voice was calm, devoid of reproach, yet it carried a weight that seemed to linger in the air. Crane nodded, his expression thoughtful, before falling silent. The unspoken acknowledgement between them said more than any words could. At a nearby table, a man with silver hair and a sharp jawline, a veteran who had earlier questioned Elijah's rank, rose from his seat and made his way over. He stopped beside Elijah, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. General Carter, the man said, his voice low and deliberate. I owe you an apology. I was wrong to doubt you. He paused, as if searching for the right words. Your achievements speak for themselves. And I regret not seeing that sooner. Elijah looked up at him, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he inclined his head. It's not easy to see what we're not looking for, he replied. The man nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening as if in acknowledgement of the deeper truth in Elijah's words. He returned to his table without another word, leaving behind a quiet ripple of introspection. The evening's final speeches carried on, but the room's focus had shifted. General Everett Hartman, who had earlier commanded the stage with ease, now spoke with a note of humility. His words softer, more deliberate, though he did not address Elijah directly. His tone suggested an unspoken deference. Elijah watched, his thoughts measured. He had spent decades in rooms like this, enduring the quiet erosion of doubt and prejudice. Tonight was no different, yet it was. The shift in the room, though subtle, felt like the distant roll of a tide, slow, steady, and unstoppable. As the event drew to a close, a few guests approached Elijah, their words carrying varying degrees of sincerity and regret. Some sought forgiveness, others validation, and a few simply sought to be seen in a better light. Through it all, Elijah remained composed. He offered polite nods and brief responses, his demeanor steady and unyielding. This wasn't a victory he had sought, but it was one he accepted with quiet dignity. The ship's engines thrummed steadily beneath them, a reminder of the journey they all shared, even if their paths had been vastly different. Later that evening, as the guests began to depart, Elijah stepped out onto the deck. The air was cool and crisp, the sea stretching endlessly into the darkness. He leaned on the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind him, the murmur of voices faded, replaced by the soothing rhythm of waves against the ship's hull. The night was quiet, but it carried with it the faint promise of change, a promise as vast and uncertain as the sea itself. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, letting the cool breeze wash over him. The battles he had fought weren't over, they never truly were. But tonight, for a moment, the weight felt lighter. When he opened his eyes, the stars above seemed brighter, their light piercing through the night. Somewhere in the vast expanse of sea and sky, there was hope, a hope that, like the tide, would rise slowly but surely, shaping the world in its quiet, persistent way. The ballroom had taken on a quieter, more reflective energy as the evening approached its conclusion. Guests lingered at their tables, some engaged in hushed conversations, others lost in thought. The violinist played a soft, lilting melody, the notes weaving through the air like whispers of a shared past. At the head table, General Everett Hartman rose once again. His commanding presence filled the room, though his tone was more subdued now. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice measured. It is my honor to invite Lieutenant General Elijah Carter to the stage. His story is one of resilience, courage, and leadership, qualities that define the very best of us. A polite round of applause followed, the sound both genuine and hesitant, as if the room was still adjusting to the weight of the evening's revelations. Elijah stood slowly, his movements deliberate. His polished shoes echoed softly against the wooden floor as he made his way to the podium. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. He stood behind the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet confidence. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably, but with a weight that demanded reflection. When I was a young officer, Elijah began, his voice steady and calm, I learned quickly that leadership is not about standing above others, but standing with them. It is about understanding that the strength of a team lies not in its hierarchy, but in its unity. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the ship's engines beneath their feet. For 32 years, I served this country, Elijah continued, not because it was easy, or because recognition was guaranteed, but because I believed and still believe that the principles this nation was built on are worth fighting for. Equality, justice, freedom. He paused, his words hanging in the air like the distant toll of a bell. But I also learned, through years of service, that these principles are not automatic. They require vigilance, effort, and courage, not just on the battlefield, but in our everyday lives. The faces before him were a mosaic of expressions, some thoughtful, others humbled, a few still guarded, but they all listened. This evening, Elijah said, his tone softening, I have been reminded of the progress we have made and the work we still have ahead of us. The fact that I stand before you as a lieutenant general, recognized for my contributions, is proof that change is possible. But the doubts, the questions, the assumptions that linger, they remind us that change is not complete. He leaned slightly forward, his voice carrying a quiet strength. It is up to us, in rooms like this, to continue the work, to see one another not through the lens of rank or color, but through the shared bond of service, sacrifice, and humanity. The room was utterly silent now, the weight of his words pressing gently but firmly against each heart. To my fellow veterans, Elijah concluded, his gaze sweeping the room, thank you for your service, your courage, and your dedication. Let us honor that service not just tonight, but every day, by ensuring that the values we fought for are upheld in how we treat one another. He stepped back from the podium, the applause that followed slow at first, then building into a standing ovation. It was not a raucous cheer, but a sustained, reverent acknowledgement of his words and the quiet power they carried. Elijah inclined his head briefly, his expression calm, before returning to his seat. As he sat, he noticed the faces around him, some tearful, others solemn, a few smiling faintly. They were the faces of people who had, in some small way, been changed. The violinist began a new piece, its melody soft and hopeful, carrying the room forward like the tide. Elijah sat back, his hands resting lightly on the table, his thoughts as steady as the horizon beyond the ship. The work was not done. But tonight, there was hope. The banquet had ended, and the guests began to disperse into the quiet corridors of the ship. Some lingered in the ballroom, exchanging subdued farewells, their voices softened by the weight of the evening. Others stepped onto the deck, seeking solace in the cool sea breeze and the vastness of the night sky. Elijah Carter was among the latter. The ship's deck was sparsely populated, the hum of conversation replaced by the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull. The stars above, brilliant and unyielding, cast a faint glow over the scene, illuminating the ocean that stretched endlessly into the darkness. Elijah leaned on the railing, his hands resting lightly against the cool metal. He gazed out at the horizon, where the line between sea and sky blurred into a seamless expanse. There was a quiet peace here, a respite from the tensions that had rippled through the evening. Behind him, footsteps approached, hesitant yet deliberate. He turned slightly, catching sight of Colonel Samuel Crane. The younger man hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. General Carter, Crane began, his voice tentative. I wanted to thank you for your speech. And for your patience. Tonight has been enlightening, to say the least. Elijah regarded him for a moment, his expression calm. It takes courage to reflect, he said, more than most people realize. Crane nodded, his gaze falling briefly to the deck. I've spent years thinking I understood what leadership meant, what it took to serve this country. But tonight, I see there's more to learn. About service, about respect. Elijah offered a faint smile, one that carried more understanding than triumph. We're all learning, Colonel. The key is to keep listening, to keep trying to see what we've missed. Crane met his gaze, and for the first time that evening, his expression carried no trace of reservation, only sincerity. I hope to do better, he said simply. Elijah inclined his head. That's all any of us can do. Crane extended his hand, and Elijah shook it firmly. As the younger man turned to leave, Elijah returned his attention to the horizon, the faint smile lingering on his lips. The night deepened, and the deck grew quieter. Elijah remained at the railing, his thoughts drifting like the waves below. He thought of the faces he had seen tonight, the skepticism, the discomfort, the eventual acknowledgement. Change, he knew, was never immediate. It was a slow tide, shaped by countless small moments of reflection and courage. In the distance, the horizon began to brighten, the first traces of dawn painting the sky with pale hues. The stars, steadfast through the night, began to fade, yielding to the promise of a new day. Elijah straightened, his gaze fixed on the light emerging from the darkness. The journey ahead would be long. The challenges unending. But the direction was clear. Behind him, the ship carried its passengers forward. A vessel of stories and lessons, of regrets and hopes. Ahead, the horizon awaited, vast and uncharted, a reminder that progress, like the sea, was boundless and enduring. With a quiet breath, Elijah turned and walked toward the warmth of the ship's interior. The night had been long. But the dawn was here. And with it, the faint but steady promise of change.